This presentation will cover Chapter 36 in your textbook. Chapter 36 looks at the Cold War and the years immediately following World War II. Kind of focus on Truman's administration, but this is Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill is still in office, and he talks about this famous quote, "The United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world." And so Winston Churchill works closely with Truman in these years shortly after World War II. On this opening slide here we have several maps that I want you to take a look at. This is post-Cold War map compared to a Cold War map. And so let's look at this one first. Europe is split into two halves basically, with this line drawn kind of right down the middle here, and line drawn separating the East and the West, separating the Soviet Union's power and their satellite countries away from NATO and the rest of Europe. And then this is the map that looks more familiar to us today, and it gets a lot more complicated with all the different countries with different alliances. Most of these countries now belong to NATO or even the European Union. So the early tensions that existed throughout Europe, the tensions that exist between the Soviet occupation of most of Eastern Europe, Poland and their claim to previously controlled Germany, land in Germany, and then Soviets and their demand for reparations from the Soviet Union. These are the big three. Of course, we have Truman, Churchill, and then Stalin. They're getting together to try to figure out a post-World War II map of Europe. Germany becomes the big tension spot. 4 occupation zones exist: the British, the French, the U.S., the Soviet Union. And so right away Europe is starting to be divided up, and this leads then to a lot of tension in the Cold War period. We also have to deal with the occupation of Japan. Shortly after the Japanese are defeated, the United States is going to occupy Japan. The abolishment of the Japanese Army and Navy. MacArthur, the winning general, takes over Japan to help them reconstruct. So the occupation, number one, to help rebuild the Japanese economy, also to create a democratic government. So there are a lot of things going on in Japan in Chapter 36 as well. Chapter 36 also looks at war crimes trials, the Nuremberg trials, and then also trials in the Japanese military. So just the World War II casualty statistics vary greatly, but estimates totaled range between 50 million to 70 million. Historians have estimated the death toll of World War II roughly to be 72 million, making it the deadliest war ever, and the civilians told around 47 million. So the civilian casualties and punishment of those responsible for those civilian casualties bring us to war crimes trials. So these are a couple of pictures of various trials that existed. I believe this is a picture of the Nuremberg trials in Germany, and then these are the pictures of the Japanese trials. I guess the Nuremberg trials of course probably more televised and more on the front page, but both trials existed. So that brings us then to the Iron Curtain speech, Winston Churchill, and his idea that the Iron Curtain has descended, and it basically descends throughout all of Europe, and this starts then this Cold War. Cold War labeled so because there are very few weapons fired, at least in Europe. The war is fought in third world countries. The hot war between these two nations is fought in third world countries, but not in Europe. So we'll focus a little bit here on then tensions in Europe. Cold War, the competition for global power, influence between the United States and the Soviet Union. This was waged mostly on political and economic fronts, not with militaries and not with weapons, but mostly political and economic fronts. So the American principles committed to democratic governments, individual freedoms, capitalist economy. Soviet Union, of course, then is founded on this communist theories, state-run economy, and using force to crush opposition. This is where the Iron Curtain kind of landed, from the Adriatic to the Baltic, from Stettin to Trieste. And this is, tensions exist on East and Western Front in Europe. One of the first manifestations of this tension occurred in Germany and the blockade. So remember that Berlin is in East Germany, and the Soviets surround West Berlin and force then the aerial rescue or aerial supply. It's called the Berlin blockade or the Berlin airlift. And almost as many missions were flown then by World War II pilots bringing in supplies as were flown during World War II. And so bringing in medicines, bringing in food, bringing in firewood, coal, whatever it took, fuel, to help this island of democracy inside the Soviet-occupied East Germany, helping this island of democracy survive. And this was a very important battle to be fought by Truman. So then we have two political organizations that eventually emerged from this early Cold War. NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, consisting of these nations, and then Stalin's Warsaw Pact, consisting of these nations. And these nations didn't really have much of a choice. They were forced to join. But these are the political and military organizations or alliances that existed, dividing Europe into two kind of geo-regions. Another big part of Chapter 36 talks about Truman's plans to the Truman Doctrine to help rebuild Europe. The Truman Doctrine gives financial aid to, in particular, Turkey and Greece, but any country in Europe that pronounces democracy as their preferred government. Marshall Plan then was the primary plan for giving this money then to Europe. And again, if you look at this map, our goal was to keep Greece and Turkey, these two countries, from becoming communist. If we could keep these two countries from becoming communist, then we could block the Soviet Black Sea Fleet, the Black Sea Fleet, the naval fleet, from leaving. It'd be very difficult for the Black Sea Fleet to get out into the Mediterranean if the United States allies were Turkey and Greece. So we could keep a close eye on any naval activity by the Soviet Union in that region. So the Truman Doctrine and Marshall Plan, very successful financial and political plan to help rebuild Europe. So these are the details of the Marshall Plan. And then this right here is a nice visual for where most of the money went. And again, trying to keep France from slipping into socialism or communism. A lot of money went to England, but then money also was generously spread out throughout these regions to counter any temptation these nations might have to becoming communist nations. These are images of a very important moment in Truman's political career, where Truman defeats Dewey, even though the headlines in the Chicago Tribune read that Dewey wins the election against Truman. So Truman, after being president, when Roosevelt dies, Truman is able to win a full 4-year term on his own. And it's at this point that communism and a policy of containing communism, become very important to Truman. Also in the early post-World War II atmosphere, the United Nations is being put into place. The General Assembly and the Security Council, permanent members. The absolute veto is in place with the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China. So the United Nations becomes very important because quickly after Truman is elected to his first full term, the issues with Korea and the spread of communism in the Korea Peninsula start to emerge. One of the first things that the United Nations deals with is Israel and the Zionism for the UN plan. We also have the Arab-Israeli War. So the founding of Israel as a place for European Jews to go post-World War II was very important. Of course, the Palestinians didn't agree with that, but Palestine was a former British colony, and the British decided that this was a place where the Jews could go, and that led then, of course, now even still today, to the fighting that exists in Israel between the Palestinians and the Jewish nation, the Israelites. Post-World War II, China is also in flux. You have various leaders like Chiang Kai-shek who are representing China on the United Nations board or on the United Nations panel, but there is a civil war existing in Beijing and throughout China, a civil war between Chiang Kai-shek and the communist Mao. So the civil war in China is between General Chiang Kai-shek and Chairman Mao. Of course, we know that the communist Chairman Mao win this conflict, and the nationalists, supported by the United States and led by Chiang Kai-shek, escape off the mainland of China to the island of Taiwan. The United States is very eager then to support Chiang Kai-shek. This is a famous picture, however, of Nixon later on in the 70s. Nixon finally willing to recognize Mao and the right of the Chinese government to exist and, in fact, take a place on the United Nations Security Council. Now we'll move on to the Korean conflict. This occurs in the 50s and late 40s, the early 50s and the late 1940s, shortly after World War II. Korea is divided into a northern Korea independent and a southern Korea independent, but the southern Korea is kind of sponsored and supported by the United States, and the northern Korea is a communist nation kind of supported and sponsored by the Chinese and especially the Soviet Union. Kim Il-sung is the leader then of the North Koreans, and we have then Ray as the leader of South Korea. Remember that during this conflict, then, the United States is still somewhat occupying Japan and helping Japan rebuild. So it's in our interest to keep a close eye on Seoul and on Korea in general. So we are interested in the division here that occurs at the parallel just north of Seoul, Korea. As it turns out, the North Koreans are encouraged and in fact sponsored by the Soviet Union and by China to invade and to test the United States resolve and to test this policy of containment that we have preached and tried to enforce. The initial invasion of Korea by the North Koreans, the initial invasion of South Korea by the North Koreans is very successful. It takes everybody off guard, and they push hard. And then at the end here, at the very end, the United States comes in and tries our best to maintain a foothold. And they maintain this foothold, and they establish by MacArthur the Pusan perimeter. Then the United States tries to push back, and the pushback comes in an invasion on the next slide. MacArthur takes over and with the help of some of the United Nations forces, MacArthur launches an invasion here at Incheon. And so at the same time he invades here they push out, and they end up pushing back the forces. They push back the forces of North Korea. Once they get to the 38th parallel, after pushing back, they get to 38th parallel, and then MacArthur actually invades North Korea. He gets a little bit too close to the Yalu River. Meanwhile, the Chinese are pouring into the mountains of North Korea. Once MacArthur gets a little bit too close to the Yalu River, all of the Chinese forces invade, surrounding U.S. Marines right here. They must be amphibiously rescued and returned to the 38th parallel. At that moment, then, the North Koreans are able to kind of push back. The North Koreans push back down to the 38th parallel, and then eventually there is kind of a armistice, a ceasefire, and a standstill, and it exists as that today, a standstill or an armistice at the 38th parallel. There's a mile-wide DMZ, demilitarized zone, right here. So North Korea is a bit of a conundrum for Truman, for the military, but all in all, we are able to force the North Koreans, force communism back out of South Korea. This is a very short presentation for Chapter 36. Tried to hit on most of the main themes. A reminder that all the images within this presentation are in the public domain. Please don't hesitate to give me a call or an email if you have any questions. Again, this goes along with Chapter 36 in the American Paget textbook, Chapter 36. That concludes this presentation.